It's Carolina here with All People's Health Collective and Disability Rights California. And we left you with a cliffhanger on the last episode with Keisha Weller and wanted to come back and briefly talk about some of the things that Keisha brought up. Specifically, she used this term called carceral feminism, which I had never heard about until I had met you, Susan. And so I thought maybe we should come back and talk about what that is, um, particularly in light of the fact that we're in a time in a kind of post-Me Too world where um, I certainly have a lot of kind of personal and cultural anxiety talking about issues around gender and sexuality. And I think a lot of other people do as well. And so um, wanted to come back and connect with you, Susan, because you were actually the first person to raise this term. And now we're talking about it as if people know what it is and how it shows up in their everyday life. And so just really, really thrilled to have you here, Susan. And I think we can just dig right in and um, you know, you can share a little bit about yourself. You know, you're with APHC, but you're also an investigator with Civil Rights Corps. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, the work you do, and how you first got involved with this issue.
Thanks, Carolina. And yeah, just to preface all of this, I do not want to position myself as an expert of any kind on carceral feminism, but I think it's more so just like this reaction and idea and like pattern in history and in the present that I think about. But I'm certainly not like a scholar on this or anything. Um, yeah, kind of as you said, my name is Susan. I'm an investigator at Civil Rights Corps, where a lot of my work focuses on supporting our challenges against the criminalization of poverty, against various injustices that take place in jails and prisons and in the pretrial detention system more broadly, and also in combating family policing, which is more commonly referred to as the child welfare system or, child protective services, which is actually kind of an area that I see some overlap with this issue of carceral feminism, just in the way that children and women are both these kinds of groups that are often described as or seen as victims, sometimes solely as victims, um, in a way that can enable this like knee-jerk response of, well, in order to protect kids or to protect women, or to protect, disabled people, like whatever group is sort of being consolidated in this way, the solution that we have, that the state has, is always, policing and prisons and punishment, and that's what's gonna make us safe, right? So it's yeah, so I guess the way that I think about carceral feminism, just to start with, is like a kind of feminism or whatever operates under like the banner of feminism, but that assumes that violence and sexual violence, gender-based violence is like caused by isolated individuals, that like individual punishment through the criminal punishment system is the only option available, and that like the system is mostly fair and works, and the carceral system is like mostly just with a few aberrations, but we can fix it with the right reform and the right little piece of tailoring this time. Um, so it's this sort of like um feminism that like launders maybe the expansion of carceral policies or prosecutorial power or like putting more people in prisons through this kind of progressive seeming language.
Man, I have so many thoughts and reactions to what you just shared, Susan. One of which is that as I was thinking about this topic of kind of, carceral feminism or governance feminism, I was talking with some friends about it, and women that, didn't grow up necessarily in academic spaces or even in like traditional left political spaces, whatever that even means in today's time. But that's a whole separate conversation. Um, and a lot of women, like, my own mother included, like, don't actually identify with this term around feminism or, um, these other kind of big ideological terms. And yet, when you're describing the idea around being victimized by men or by others, they certainly have always been the first to say, like, wait, hold up here. Like, there's actually, um, like, the path forward here is not to um, victimize myself in this situation. And so it's just interesting to think about that contrast, in terms of how it is people um, do or don't identify with terms. And I think in the case of carceral feminism, I think there's a lot of people out there that would say, yeah, I'm not down with like hurting people, even in instances where there's been, say, cases of like, um, and I don't even want to use one term because I think it's a big spectrum, right? A big spectrum of experiences around in this case, sex and sexuality. You've got things like, everything from sexual misunderstanding, miscommunication, to regret, to violations, to violence, to experimentation, right? And so that's like the bracket of conversations that I think a lot of people, men and women, want to be having, but we can't because so much of the feminist dialogue gets drawn into this punishment framework as well as the child welfare system.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, a lot of that really resonates, Carolina. And um, we were kind of talking about this just before this episode started, but I think there's a certain set of issues or charges that is sort of particularly like laden with trauma and emotion and fear. Um, and pain for a lot of people. So rape is certainly one of those, child abuse is another one. And it's not that like that pain is like not real in a way. Like these feelings are real in the sense that they are really and deeply felt for a lot of people, but they don't like necessarily tell you the truth of a situation and they don't give you an analysis of the structure that you're operating within. And so, I think sometimes with these charges, there's this like knee-jerk reaction where the issue of sexual violence then isn't actually engaged with seriously. It's not thought of as part of like a system and a structure, but it's kind of this like cudgel where, the moment you bring up rape, that means that like the time for critical thinking is over, the time to like really think about what the solutions and alternatives and possibilities are to really address this harm is over. And you just have to like act and react immediately. And there's this way where it just like, you know, funnels things into punishment as part of like this carceral common sense solution. Um, and yeah, I guess I just think about this, especially in a moment, and this isn't necessarily carceral feminism, but there's a similar dynamic that I see play out when people talk about like what's happening in cities where people, talk about like needing to feel safe when they're walking around in their neighborhoods. And that feeling of safety is not the same thing as like actual safety. And very often what that kind of dialogue leads to is this like reaction of, well, we just need to like warehouse people. We need to like sweep encampments off our streets. We need to lock people up. We need to pathologize them. We just like need to hide the problem from out of view. And that doesn't actually make people safer. And it also doesn't mean that things were like unsafe in the first place. Um, that's not a perfect analogy, obviously, but I think it's a similar sort of like dynamic that's going on. Um, and it's just, I think like we owe it to people who have experienced sexual violence. And there are many, many women who are like, especially the women who are most harmed and most disproportionately caught up in the carceral system, who are also often like most subject to sexual violence or domestic violence, um, but get left out of these conversations where, again, like punishment is the only solution, and it's imagined as like that is what justice means.
Yeah. I want to come back to this topic because I think what you're pointing to is not only get left out of these conversations, but have been burned by these conversations as well. Um, and that's the piece that I was sort of tiptoeing around before, when I said like, you know, there's there was this kind of explosive, Me Too movement, primarily in the um, film and television, world of film and television, or it became something situated in the film and television world, and um, was portrayed as this huge leap in um, accountability and all these like actually like very um, punitive terms, right? Like the big showcase that was the Harvey Weinstein trial and all the people that were taken down. But when you say people were left out, I think it very much applies in that context, but also to take it a step further, that people have also been burned. People who have wanted to actually have serious conversations about um, the full range of sexual experiences, but haven't been able to because the people that get to set the terms of that conversation oftentimes are, um, wealthier, oftentimes do have strong ties and investments in law enforcement. And that's what we saw exactly in the case of SB 258, where we saw um, this coalition come together of largely like feminist political groups, feminist voter groups, women's voters groups, and um, district attorneys come together to put forth, a piece of legislation that is not actually going to address any um, real serious um, instances of violence. That's not what this bill is going to do. That's the conversation around like, things like rape. That's not going to be solved by SB 258. And so um, it's just making me think about like how you and I got connected on SB 258, because I remember someone, the public, the policy was brought to me. I work at DRC, um, and folks brought the issue to me, and I brought it to the IDD leaders, including, Wesley Witherspoon, who actually was the man that told me this is an issue that in particular will impact women. Um, and after that is when I talked to Keisha Weller, who was on the podcast last episode. And that's when we started to work on the issue more seriously. And when I started to like peep game on who was supporting the bill and who was opposing the bill, I realized that some of these big women's organizations were actually supporting the bill, which just felt really strange, given the impact that this bill would have on women with IDD. And so that's when I started to sense like, oh, something weird is going on here, something deeper is going on here. And and I remember bringing it to you in one of our spaces, and I'm just curious, like, what was it like for you from where the position you were sitting in, to spot that in this piece of legislation, and how did you, um, recognize that showing up?
Yeah. I mean, it's again, want to disclaim that like Carolina, you do much more work on this than I do, and so please feel free to correct me if I get anything wrong. But I think the red flag for me is like you said, like how is this bill being backed by all of these groups that have like gender equality and like activists for women and feminist in the name, um but it's also being backed by like the California District Attorneys Association. Like there's just like there's nothing good that comes out of that. And then, when I was looking at their website, at the website for the backers of SB 258, the language on there frames the bill as such a like common sense solution. Like there's this line in there that's like, shockingly, there's a loophole that permits rape of a spouse who's unable to consent due to a severe disability. So it's like that word like shockingly that suggests like, well, how could there possibly be anything wrong with this solution? Or like, oh my God, like you're supposed to like immediately just feel this outrage, and like this is like the patch up that's offered. Um, but it doesn't actually, you know, tell you about like how like in what sense would criminalizing more people actually protect like women with IDD.
Right, right. No, I think that's, you pointed that out to me, and I was like, oh, we need to explore this and try and understand it better together. And we ended up even um, putting together a letter calling out and calling in all of these feminist organizations and saying, like, this is not like consistent with your mission, and consistent with the issues that we and that women I know, whether they self-identify as a feminist or not, want to see. These are not the solutions that we want to see pursued forward when it comes to issues around, um, the full range of sexual experience, everything from experimentation to violence and everything in between. Um, and we got no response from, not a single feminist organization responded to our letter in that call out. So, um, anyways, I just wanted to sort of bring us to a conclusion on that particular note, because um, California is seen as this, like, you know, symbol and, um, you know, as a symbol of like kind of progressive values for I think a lot of people, and in particular for women. And in this case, 258 was even backed by, Senator Wahab, who's a woman, and Michelle Dauber, who's you know, a law professor at Stanford University, right? So, here's very clearly some of the contradictions that, actually I think indicate our state is not really where, people think it is, right? It was supported by the California Legislative Women's Caucus hearing, um, and it's kind of, flying forward, if you will, with support. So, um, well, Susan, I'm here in California, you're in New York. I wore my Dodgers hat. I don't know if you're a Yankees fan, or I won't go there because I'm not trying to. We're already on thin ice being canceled talking around women's issues in a post-Me Too world, so I'm not trying to get you canceled on a cultural level. But I do want to hear from you, just like, as a person living in New York, in all the different ways that you um, show up as a person. I mean, how do you see beyond, SB 258, and as well as your work in, child welfare systems, how do you see um, this idea of kind of regulating, trying to regulate and trying to create bureaucratic procedures around um, gender and sexuality and the full range of sexual experiences, everything from experimentation to real instances of harm. How do you see that and instances of what we call kind of carceral feminism show up in everyday, culture?
That's a really great question. I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm maybe especially sensitive to this because of the no new jails fight in New York, which was a long, long story to tell, but as you may know, Rikers is being ordered to close within a few years. And so the city has pivoted to trying to build new jails in each borough. It's going to be extremely expensive. They've got a proposal for like the largest or the tallest rather jail in the world that is supposed to go up in the heart of Chinatown, and another one here in Brooklyn where I am. Um, and they're doing all of these like community input sessions where, they'll have people like, or they'll sort of be talking about like, well, we're gonna like have like a really nice women's spot, or we're gonna like make sure that there are murals and art programs for people who are detained, and there's gonna be a skylight, and it's like, well, at the end of the day, you're building a new jail, and um, and maybe that's not the most like direct example, but it's um yeah, this maybe just this like failure of imagination that happens where a lot of like energy that I don't know how much of it I can say is like in good faith, but even as supposing some of it is like people who like want reforms in good faith, um, you know, all of that energy kind of gets channeled towards these like supposed reforms that actually just end up putting more stock and more money and more faith in like punishment systems, instead of investing in actual community safety and like pushing people to think beyond like what happens if we just like don't make a new jail? Like, hey, has anyone thought of that? Um, yeah, so that's kind of what's coming up for me. And the other thing that comes up culturally, I'm not on social media so much these days, which is really good for my brain. But I feel like when I was, I would get sometimes these like random TikToks or reels, or I would see in the comments of a post like people, there's this like what Next Door, I think is the app, like this sort of um vibe of like everyone be careful, like, women are being trafficked in this parking lot outside of your grocery store on like this street, and then everyone in the comments like tagging other people, and it's like, well, like I can't say like how many of those cases like are real, but there's just like this huge like storm of panic and like paranoia, I guess, culturally that's generated. Um, yeah, so thankfully I'm not around that so much, but it just
But it's
can
around you,
begin
whether you like it or not.
to, yeah, yeah, or even like I don't know, like I think of like true crime shows and things like that.
I know, yeah, like Law and Order SVU, I think is a classic example where
Yeah.
you've got like Mariska Hargitay acting like this, you know, um, aggressive cop who's going to catch every single person that's committed sexual assault and put them behind bars. And
Yeah, I
that's,
guess I feel like I'm like being told to be more scared than I am if I'm just like living my life and walking around my neighborhood. I'm like, I'm fine. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
well, and the example that you gave of Nextdoor, um, I think all of us, whether we've wanted to be impacted by Nextdoor or not, have been. Um, and the panic that people feel from being on these like apps, right? And I'm curious, you mentioned the word panic and you didn't say it explicitly, but I am curious to know like how do you see this idea around, you know, um, punishing people for the full range of sexual experiences? How do you see that as tied to a certain kind of actual Puritanism or um, like panic around sex and sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so much. It's kind of ironic. To me, that was another thing that came up, I guess, when I first learned about SB 258, that there's this like supposedly feminist intervention that operates on the assumption that disabled people and disabled women or women with like IDD just don't have the capacity to consent or have like the desire for love and intimacy or kind of the presumed like the right to bodily autonomy, when that to me is sort of like I don't know, like what was the 20th century women's movement even for? Like, um, yeah, it's I'm sorry, I just lost the track of my thought. But yeah, I think that is just really jarring to me. Um, I don't know if I answered the question. I think I kind of lost the thread of the question, actually.
No, not at all. I think you're pointing to the fact that like we're really not as far as we think we are, when it comes to these issues. Because it's a good question. What is the 20th century been for? You know, if this is where we're landing and this is what's being considered progressive policy in California, are things like SB 258 or Rikers Island in New York, right? We're the coasties, if you will. And yet we're pushing some of the most hurtful ideas around people and hurtful policies around people.
Mhm.
Um, and so, I think you did answer it exactly how I was imagining. Um, well, I mean, there's a lot of threads here that we could go down or sort of, unravel. And I'm curious, like, you are thinking a lot about these issues as you're, both in your work, but also as you're planning to potentially return to do academic work. And um, I guess like I'm curious to hear like why do you think this matters, for people, whether they self-identify, as any type of identity or not, which, that's the world we live in now, right? It's like you've got, people lead with sort of the identity and self-identification, but the reality is that that's actually put a lot of people in danger and also hasn't been always, I think, um, the idea of kind of identity politics hasn't always been, and certainly not in recent years, I think, traded in um, honestly, and authentically. And so I'm just curious, like, why do you think this even matters as a concept for people, whether they self-identify as someone part of this work or not, or part of this identity or not?
Yeah, I mean, I do not identify as like a member of the IDD community. I would say that I have like a complicated relationship to feminism because of all the ways that that term has been um, used to justify things that I really don't believe in. But I do, in some way, like I do care deeply about sexual violence. I do care about um women's autonomy and dignity and like justice. And I think that's kind of why it's really important to me to be able to think clearly about these different tensions within what is being called feminism, which has like there are amazing people like Keisha who are doing amazing work on this. I don't know if Keisha would identify as a feminist, but there are certainly like abolitionist feminists out there. Um, and then, there are also ways where the so-called radical feminist movement is just all about like criminalizing non-conforming um kind of gender expressions and trans women. And all of that kind of gets like lumped together. And um I think it's just really important, maybe especially at this moment where like yeah, like radical feminism is so insurgent, and there is like such a panic around things like God, like so much like trans people, immigration, etc. That's all kind of laundered under like the idea of protecting women, protecting kids, protecting girls, all of that. I think the other thing is just, I mean, as you were kind of pointing out, Carolina, like this is really an important example of how like the carceral state can kind of assimilate like so many different ideas, but then just like end up perpetuating itself, right? Like you said, like California is considered the bluest state in the country, whatever, like there are lots of issues with that, but whether you're sort of having this like Republican rhetoric of like directly like, oh, we should just be throwing more people into jails and prisons and kind of in a more explicit way, like criminalizing um, different groups, in a way that is obviously also like gendered and racialized and disproportionately harms people with disabilities. Whether you're doing that or whether you're doing what we see in like liberal states like California and New York of, well, we're doing this to protect vulnerable people. But then, again, it's like, in what sense is this protection and like what actually happens? I mean, when you just give prosecutors more power, you just end up reinforcing that incarceration and punishment is the solution to these, again, like, often like very real harms that happen. Um, but yeah, I think it's just a really important moment, especially when like there's so much attention paid to all of the sort of like outright fascism in the country, to still remain kind of clear-eyed about like ultimately like what are the alternatives to this system and like how do we push beyond a system that only offers punishment.
Yeah. Um, well, Susan, thank you for hopping on and giving people a digest on these ideas. We said we wanted this to be a series, and I think you've left us at a point where we now can answer that question and hopefully have, other folks on that can speak to um, what the answers are because they're there, right? And so I'm so grateful to have had you on today, Susan. And we'll need to have you back, and maybe this will be incorporated into your grad school applications. Um,
Thanks for the reminder, Carolina.
I know October and November is going to be busy, so thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation and thanks for having me on and accommodating my kind of rambling thoughts.
No, it's the only way it should be. All right. Well, until next time, thanks everybody.